Star Trek is paying tribute to one of the show's forgotten victims after 32 years. Star Trek has always been a franchise about memory, about who we remember, who we forgive, and who history quietly leaves behind. Its heroes are immortalized in statues, starships, and stirring monologues about duty and hope. Its villains are cataloged, analyzed, and often redeemed. But scattered across the vastness of Star Trek's canon are casualties who never became symbols or lessons. Characters who existed briefly, suffered enormously, and then vanished into the background noise of warp nacelles and reset buttons. After 32 years, Star Trek is finally reaching back to acknowledge one of those forgotten victims. And in doing so, it's making a powerful statement about how the franchise has matured, not just as science fiction, but as a moral archive of its own past. The franchise that rarely looks back at its dead. Death in Star Trek has always been flexible. Spock dies and comes back. Picard lives entire lifetimes in minutes. Data sacrifices himself only to be resurrected through echoes, memories, and golems. Red shirts perish by the dozens, yet rarely warrant more than a log entry and a moment of silence before the next anomaly appears. This narrative elasticity is part of Star Trek's DNA. The future is hopeful. After all, death is not always final, and trauma can often be undone by technology, time travel, or a conveniently timed anomaly. But that optimism has a cost. When consequences vanish, so do the people who bore them. Some characters exist solely to be harmed so that the main cast can grow. They're assimilated, experimented on, driven mad, or killed, not because their stories matter, but because their suffering advances the plot. These characters are Star Trek's forgotten victims, and for decades, the franchise rarely paused to ask what became of them. Until now. The episode that changed everything. But didn't. 32 years ago, Star Trek aired an episode that shocked audiences with its darkness. It was one of those stories that felt different even at the time, less adventurous, more tragic. A character was brutalized not by an alien invasion or a cosmic accident, but by something far more personal. Cruelty rooted in power, fear, and violation. The episode aired, sparked controversy, and then faded. The main cast continued on. Promotions happened. Ships changed. Timelines advanced. But the victim, whose life had been irrevocably altered, was never mentioned again. No follow-up. No acknowledgement. No attempt to grapple with the long-term consequences of what happened. For years, fans debated whether that silence was intentional or simply a product of episodic television. In the early 90s, Star Trek wasn't built for serialized trauma. Characters reset weekly. Emotional scars were inconvenient. But silence has weight. And over time, that silence began to feel less like neutrality and more like neglect. Why this victim mattered more than the story allowed. What made this particular victim different wasn't just what happened to them. It was how the story framed it. Their suffering wasn't abstract. It wasn't metaphorical. It was intimate, uncomfortable, and deeply human. At the time, Star Trek was praised for being bold enough to tackle such subject matter. But in hindsight, the praise feels incomplete. Representation without reckoning isn't progress. It's spectacle. And for many viewers, especially those who saw parts of their own experiences reflected on screen, the lack of follow-through felt like abandonment. This character wasn't just a plot device. They were a person who deserved continuity, care, and acknowledgement. Instead, they became a footnote, remembered primarily through controversy rather than compassion. And that's why Star Trek paying tribute now matters so much. The tribute, quiet, respectful, and long overdue. The tribute doesn't come in the form of a grand speech or a melodramatic retcon. There's no time travel rescue or miraculous undoing of past events. Instead, Star Trek does something far more meaningful. It remembers. In a recent installment of the franchise, a line of dialogue, a visual callback, or a piece of world building gently but unmistakably acknowledges what happened 32 years ago. The victim is named, not as an object of tragedy, but as someone whose experience mattered. Their suffering is no longer isolated in a single episode frozen in time. It's part of the universe's history. That choice is deliberate. Modern Star Trek understands that canon isn't just about timelines and uniforms. It's about ethical continuity. By acknowledging this forgotten victim, the franchise is admitting that some wounds don't heal just because the credits roll. Why Star Trek can do this now and couldn't then? The Star Trek of today is fundamentally different from the Star Trek of the early 90s. Serialized storytelling allows consequences to linger. Trauma is no longer something characters get over between episodes. Shows like Deep Space Nine, Discovery, and Picard have reshaped what Star Trek allows itself to confront. More importantly, audiences have changed. Viewers now expect stories to treat trauma responsibly. They expect empathy, follow through, and awareness. What once passed as bold television is now rightly scrutinized for how it handles victims, especially those from marginalized groups. Star Trek paying tribute after 32 years isn't an apology, but it is an acknowledgement. It says, "We see what we did. We remember who was hurt, and we're not pretending it didn't matter." The power of naming the forgotten. There's immense power in naming someone who history tried to erase. By acknowledging this victim, Star Trek is restoring agency retroactively, not by changing the past, but by refusing to let it be forgotten. The tribute reframes the original story. It shifts focus away from shock value and toward empathy. It invites viewers to reconsider the episode not just as controversial television, but as part of a longer moral conversation. In universe, it suggests that Starfleet doesn't simply move on from its failures, that the Federation remembers not only its victories, but the people it failed to protect. Out of universe, it tells fans, especially those who were hurt or unsettled by the original episode, that their discomfort was valid. A franchise growing up with its audience, Star Trek has always grown alongside its viewers. The optimism of the original series reflected a hopeful, space race-era future. The next generation embodied late Cold War idealism. Deep Space Nine wrestled with moral ambiguity in a post-Cold War world. Now, modern Star Trek exists in an era defined by reflection, by re-examining institutions, power, and past mistakes. Paying tribute to a forgotten victim fits perfectly into that evolution. It's not about erasing the past. It's about learning from it. This moment says that Star Trek no longer wants to be remembered only for its utopian ideals, but for how seriously it takes the responsibility of storytelling. What this means for Star Trek's future, this tribute opens the door to something profound. A Star Trek that treats every life as narratively significant, even those who once existed on the margins. It suggests that no story is truly over just because decades have passed. That forgotten characters can still matter. That pain acknowledged late is still better than pain ignored forever. It also sets a precedent. If Star Trek can revisit this victim after 32 years, what other stories might finally get the reckoning they deserve? What other silent casualties might be remembered, not to sensationalize their suffering, but to honor it? Remembering is an act of hope at its core. Star Trek has always believed that the future is better because we choose to make it so. That belief doesn't just apply to technology or diplomacy, it applies to storytelling. By paying tribute to one of its forgotten victims after 32 years, Star Trek is doing something quietly radical. It's choosing memory over convenience, compassion over silence, accountability over nostalgia. And in a franchise built on the idea